Hello and welcome to St Michael's Churchyard in Ford, just to the west of Shrewsbury. My name's Mark Duffell. I'm an ecologist with Arvensis Ecology. We've been working with the church and the churchyard community and the locals in the village to understand the churchyard and the environmental processes going on. So we've been undertaking various ecological surveys, bat walks, community wildlife events and full botanical surveys to help us understand the site and then form a management plan. These lovely Oxide Daisies, large big daisy flower heads here, and this is really Oxide Daisy season at the moment. In a few weeks and they'll change and go to seed and a different species will take over. So looking in this area a month ago, it was bright red with red clover, and we had Germander speedwell with its lovely blue flowers as well. We've got this biscuit coloured grass. The flowers have now finished and they've gone to seed. This is sweet vernal grass. It's a really beautiful grass when it's in flower and in seed for this lovely colour and the movement, and then it's got the sweet scent of new mown hay, freshly mown hay when you cut it. Other species around this, we've got bright yellow, what look like to many people dandelions. This is Catsair, and Catsair has a flat rosette of leaves on the ground with these lovely bright yellow flowers, and these are the favourite, one of the food plants for nectaring plants for things like hoverflies and other invertebrates. Several other grasses I can see. We've got this tall grass. This is false oat grass, which has a lovely shimmering look, and you might just be able to see the long bristles, the awns on each of the individual flowers. This is a species which tolerates doesn't really tolerate mowing much, so just having 2 mows a year will reduce it, and potentially having too much of this in a grassland can actually reduce the ecological importance. So it's something that we're looking with our management by slightly increasing the mowing, have a spring mow as well as a end of hay cut mow. We'll hopefully knock back some of this, and if you look behind us we can see it's quite dominating the area there, and in future it'd be nice to reduce the amount of that. So we're in one of the drier areas in the churchyard. This is probably a 12th century grassland. You can see the soil here is so thin and so free draining that actually the plants look to be suffering a bit, but this is perfectly natural. We've had a very dry May and we're coming into June and it's still pretty dry. One of the species that's showing and indicating the habitats here and how good they are is this beautiful lemon yellow flower. This is mouse-ear hawkweed, and if we compare it to the Catsair that's also nearby, you can see how different in colour it is. It's often, the mouse-ear hawkweed has red backs to the flowers, so these are showing it quite nicely there. Red tips to the petals, individual petals. And we've also got other indicators of this very nutrient poor and free draining soils. So we've got this lovely plant here, these beautiful little tiny little red flowers. This is sheep sorrel, and you can see the individual leaves are meant to look like little spears which have these pointy projections on them, and they've got a nice flavour as well. So within the drier, shorter grasslands within the churchyard, you occasionally come across these bumps, and they're quite substantial. That's about a foot, 300 millimetres high, 30 centimetres high, and probably going on for 18 inches, 45 centimetres in diameter. And they're scattered around the churchyard, and you may wonder what the churchyard management team have been doing. Why have they created these? Well, actually it's one of the example of the diversity within the churchyard. So what they are anthills, and they're yellow ants, and quite common in grasslands. You find these ant species making the hills, and they form the plants that live on them actually form slightly different communities to elsewhere. So again, we've got the sheep sorrel on the top here that thrives in the drier soils, and can makes use of these bare patches, which are these bare patches have been created by a green woodpecker, which comes along and bashes open a hole in there, then sticks its tongue within the ant's nest and licks out the ants, rather like an armadillo might do in South America. But we've got just as much exciting species in the UK. So we're in the lower part of the churchyard at the upper end of it, and this is the most nutrient rich, the most vigorous area. You can see the height of these grasses. This is false oat grass, a really coarse species, big broad leaves, and it's quite dominant. We've also got another quite a coarse species. This is one called Foxtail Meadowfox, has beautiful soft spike-like panicles. These structures here are called spike-like panicles, with little wispy awns on them, and hence soft like a fox's tail. Scientific name is Hypercaris, which means alope is a fox and urus is a tail, and pratensis means of the meadows. But these are all quite coarse species. It's showing that we've got a lot of vigour, a lot of nutrients in the soil. So what we're planning to do is, by mowing this early in the year, by cutting it early in the year, we'll knock some of that vigour out, take the nutrients away, and then we'll manage it like the rest of the site as a hay meadow. And in time we're hoping that we'll be able to get it to the similar sort of biodiversity as elsewhere.
So why is this patch of the churchyard so much more vigorous than the upper part? Is there a difference in previous management?
It's a bit unclear totally what's going on here, but the research I've managed to do is found that the lower part of the churchyard was owned by one of the local families until the 1870s and was managed as an orchard, and also had potentially had livestock on here. So you often brought livestock close to the house when they were lambing or calving, and that you then have all the nutrients that come out of the lambing sheds and the calving sheds, and that nutrient was probably spread here. There's even a potential that this was an allotment. So it's been gardened in the past and managed, and it's increased the nutrients, and we've got to knock that back. Several hundred years of nutrients we've got to get rid of. Whereas the upper churchyard is 12th century grassland. It was there before the churchyard was there, and it's been managed in quite a different way. There would have been people coming in and probably doing a hay cut with a scythe, and they're taking that away and feeding their livestock, whether it was their own cattle or horses or even rabbits and those kind of animals. So like many churchyards, you've got memorials to people who've fallen in battles. So this was installed in 1920 by the local villagers who raised funds to memorialise those who've been killed in the First World War. And then since that time, obviously, we had the Second World War, and they've also been remembered on stone. This area of churchyard, you can see the grass is kept a lot shorter. This is deliberately done, because it's more, this is the active part of the churchyard. You can see the current gravestones there. I can see someone there buried in 2002, and those more recently. So it's a good place to look. You can see the different management. So we've got the closer crop churchyard here. So this is more respectful for those who are more recently interred and the families who are visiting. You can see fresh flowers from people who visited recently. The church wall there, the churchyard wall that goes in between the two sites. This is the lower churchyard we're in, and then we've got the upper churchyard. The lower churchyard was bought by the church, or given to the church, in 1877. So it's newer, but still not that new. But it's also a lot more nutrient rich than the higher churchyard. By that I mean it's got more nitrogen, more food for the plants. So therefore the grasses are a lot more vigorous. They're a lot coarser. We don't have those fine grasses like sweet vernal grass, red fescue, the yellow oat grass, and nice species like that. We've got a bit more dominance of false oat grass and foxtail and those sort of things, meadow foxtails. One of the reasons for this is this area was traditionally managed, on the old maps you can see it had an orchard in here, and I suspect there were livestock in here, so there was dunging going on as well. So looking up beyond the current modern graves, you can see as the graves go further back, they change their form and their shape, and they get older, and we can see that the grassland is quite coarse and quite tall in the background. So our plans are that we'll maintain the current mowing regime that we're on here with the short grassland. All of the recent graves up to about where that golden conifer is that you can see, and there's a holly tree as well. We'll keep that regularly mown once or twice every month, or even more. And the area beyond there we'll have to cut once or twice a year, or maybe a little bit more. And that area is brilliantly diverse for things like small mammals. So the big tree just with the seats just underneath it is a variegated holly that's been planted in some time. Just to its right we've got a yew, and yew trees are again very traditional in churchyards. They're symbolic, or have a lot of Christian and pagan symbolisms. This is a Taxus baccata, a straight variety, so it just grows out laterally and forms an even bush shape. Then as we pan around again, we've got a plain or non-variegated form of holly, Ilex aquifolium. Hollies have that lovely red berry, and this is actually one of the plants that can earn the churchyard a little bit of money. Every few years somebody will come and chop bits off the holly tree and sell it at the markets, at the Christmas markets. Then next to it we've got two conifers. These are yellow forms of Lawson cypress, Chamaecyparis lawsoniana lutea. You can just about make out some small cones there. They used to be a good site for two tawny owls that used to sit on them, and in the evenings you could call across and they'd hoot across back at you. The grey tree there is another conifer. So this is a blue atlas cedar, Cedrus atlantica glauca, and it's another common plant that's often planted in churchyards. I can see, looking in its branches, I can see there's blue tits going around feeding on the aphids, and often you get firecress as well, working their way, firecress and goldcress working their way through it. And the last tree again is another yew, Taxus baccata. This is one of again another traditional churchyard plant, and it's been planted either side of the path. So some of the longer areas of grassland that we've left in the churchyard, we've left them deliberately long because they've got species like this. It doesn't look very exciting now, but it's actually a cowslip that's gone to seed, or is going to seed, and we're wanting it to fully ripen, and then the seeds will spread and establish even further in this grassland. And this particular area of grassland here is covered in spring, certainly along the paths, with wild cowslips. So occasionally scattered through the churchyard you've got this plant called crow garlic. It's a member of the onion family, so it's an allium, and if you were to nibble a bit it tastes very strongly of onions or garlic, and it has these curious flowers. At the moment they haven't opened, but you can see there's a pink bud there forming. This will unwrap, and instead of flowers it actually produces little bulbils, so like little garlic cloves almost. And each of those can break up and scatter and fall away in the grassland. And with our modern farming techniques we've actually eradicated this from a lot of our farmlands, but it's just scattered through. There's another plant here of it within the meadow, scattered through, and it forms just another bit of the diversity of the churchyard. So we've got a little community of plants here. We've got two daisy relatives and then a speedwell. And we'll start looking at this one. This is these lovely shaggy hairs all up and down the stem. This is fox and cubs. Named that, or hens and chickens is another name. You've got the hen on the top and the chicks all around the base, or the mother fox and the cubs all around the base. And they start out with a single flower, and then as it ages, the first flower dies over and is replaced by these other flowers. They've got these lovely bristly leaves, really coarse bristle-like leaves. So fox and cubs. Brightens up this bit of the churchyard, adds some different colours. You can see it's slowly spreading around by these runners and invading the path, but it's also in the grassland. The relative nearby, you can see how similar they look, different colours but similar forms. So again, the same family, the daisy family, the Asteraceae. This is Catsair, Hypercaris radicarta. Notice how the stems here are really smooth compared to the past specimen, which was really hairy. They've got lovely yellow flowers, and then when you start looking closely inside, they've got an unusual feature called a receptacular scale, which is one of the ways to identify them. And they form flat rosettes within the grassland, so they're forming these big rosettes here that merge in with the grasses. And then coming down here, we've got a plant called Germander speedwell. These lovely strong blue flowers. And Germander speedwell, one of its features, ID features, which might be quite hard to pick up on the camera, but is it has 2 lines of white hairs down the stems, and no other Veronica or Germander does this. So you can just make out one line there, and if I rotate it, you've got another line on the back, another on the other side. So Veronica camidris, and the scientific name camidris means, cami means ground, and dryas is an old name for an oak, and apparently the early describers thought that it looked like a ground oak, the leaves growing on the ground. Here in the shade beneath a large yew tree, we've got a plant that really thrives in this slightly dark and shadier habitat. This is an iris. You may be familiar with irises growing by ponds, and they're the yellow iris or yellow flag iris, and this is Iris foetidissima. Foetidissima means fetid or unpleasant smelling, and I wouldn't say it's particularly unpleasant, but it's got a very distinctive smell. Common names are stinking iris, again maybe a bit unfair. We've got Gladden iris and beefsteak plant as well, beef heart plant. So I'm just going to tear off a leaf and ask Jenny, our cameraman, to have a sniff, and she can tell me what she thinks it smells of.
Yeah, it does smell of beef, like Bovril.
Yeah. To my mind, as a vegetarian, I think it smells like gravy browning. So that artificial, quite meaty smell. And then later on in the year, the flowers don't last particularly long, but later on in the year we get these lovely seed heads with bright red berries, seeds, which this is from last year, and when they're fresh they're really glorious, and florists often use them in their flower arrangements. So it may be quite a sombre coloured flower, but it's a very beautiful one. So in any churchyard or burial ground there's lots of users, and you have to think about all the different people who might have an interest, and not just people, but who might have an interest in burial grounds and their use and how they're managed. So within this churchyard there are a lot of users, people who've got an interest and a want to use this space. So we've got the church building behind, there's people who go and worship at this church, there's the Reverend who leads the services there, and they occasionally lead services outside in the grounds as well. So they're an important part of the community that need to be considered. There's also the past burials, the people who have been buried here in the past, sort of several hundred years ago potentially, and then there's current burials. So the lower churchyard has different management requirements to the upper churchyard. So there are less likely to be members of the family still around from those who were buried several hundred years ago, whereas down the bottom of the hill they're very recent burial sites. So those are some of the main people we've got to consider. There's also the local village nearby, a ford, and people walk through and use this as a form of recreation, to view and see nature and wildlife. flora and fauna. And just as importantly, we need to consider the flora and fauna that we've got here. If we look at the wider landscape, this particular patch of ford, and often in many other areas of the landscape, is particularly diverse. We'd have to go an awful long way, potentially to another churchyard or a nature reserve, to get an area as species rich as this. So the plants and animals that we find in churchyards deserve just as much care and attention as any national nature reserve.
So who are the main people or groups that are interested in or have some involvement in the management of churchyards like this?
The main people with responsibility for this churchyard are the church and the church committee, who have to manage this site, and they've got quite an onerous task. There's a lot of money involved in cutting grass and maintaining this kind of site. We've got an old property, old gravestones that need management and managing for potential risks, falling over and that sort of thing.
And similarly with the trees as well?
Yeah, there's lots of trees as well, which we've got potentially could have issues with. They need regular pruning or management to keep in a health safe. So yes, the churchyards have, the church as itself has a big role to play. The other people who are involved in the management are people like ourselves, ecologists, and people who help understand how to manage the land. So if we were to manage all of the site like this area here and really closely crop it and mow it, we're creating an awful lot of grass clippings that need to be taken away, and this area here is being managed, thankfully for free, by a local member of the community who comes in once or twice a month, maybe even every month in the growing season, and mows this for free and takes away the grass clippings. That's an awful lot of work, that's an awful lot of time. If we were to manage all of the grassland like this, there would not be the funds to do it, and the expense of carting away the grass clippings as well. So we've got those sort of things. There's also the local other members of the community offer their services, their labour at times, to come in and help on one-off activities. So maybe that will be an annual cut. And the way we're looking at managing the site is going from, we had a quite intensive cutting regime where the chap came in quite regularly, but he left the grass on the ground, and that has unfortunately made the grass more vigorous. It's put the nutrients back in the ground. What you want to do on this kind of site is take the nutrients away, remove it, make the soil poorer. In this case, that's a good thing, and that means we need less cuts. So the more we can take away and remove the off cuttings, the arisings away, the better the grass will be.
So now with a different management regime, managing more of the churchyard for meadows, presumably this means fewer cuts per year, and that presumably is cheaper. So it's a win-win situation.
It is, yes. Once you've got the regime sorted and understood and everyone understands it, then yes, it should potentially be a lot cheaper. And we're lucky in that we've got farmers and landowners locally who will accept the green waste freely and will take it away, and they actually use it to make green. They use it as a compost, and then that gets sold off to other people. So it's actually as a resource. We don't get any money for it, but the cost of clearing it away otherwise and disposing of it would be excessive for us. So yeah. What we'd like to do in the future is get more community involvement, get more locals involved. Recently we've been working with Caring for God's Acre to bring in their volunteer team and actually bash the site early on in the spring, come in and scythe it and do an early hay cut, remove that excessive material, certainly in that area up in the top of the lower churchyard where it's very vigorous. Take that away and allow the spring flowers to come through. Then we will leave it, and at the end of June, when the traditional hay meadow cuts would have been done, we'll then come in and cut it again. And that can be by either using volunteers from Caring for God's Acre who might be using hand scythes, or they might be using strimmers. And we've also got a contractor who produces a very reasonable price.
So when would normally a hay meadow like this be cut?
We'd be expecting, it depends where you are in the country. So if we're in Scotland, then it's going to be later in the season because the growing season starts later. In Kent, it would start a lot earlier. So I would be expecting by the end of June that we should be coming in and doing a cut. So we're looking at managing the site as much as we can with volunteers, whether that's volunteers from the local village coming in and providing an afternoon of work, or working with the local charity called Caring for God's Acre. We had lined up earlier this year that we'd get a group of volunteers coming in and we'd be scything the more vigorous patches to knock down the vigour of the grass. So by scything and cutting and taking that away, we're reducing the nutrients. The previous management had been a case that it was trimmed and just left, and it was piling up the nutrients. That's why some of the areas have declined slightly in the past 10 years of what they used to be, because the nutrients have been building up and building up. Rather like a lawn at your home, if you just trim it and leave it, you'll end up with a thick mulch, and only those dominant coarser grasses will dominate, and you'll lose the nice diversity of the flowering plants.
Could you say a little bit more about Caring for God's Acre and what they do?
So Caring for God's Acre this year is their beautiful burial grounds project. They work across all of the UK, and they work to help churchyards and burial grounds manage their spaces better. So whether that's helping them survey the site, so understand what lives there, what's using their site, also looking at interpreting what's been found there and explaining to the parishioners, the users as well. And they also have their volunteers who come out and will help you manage the site. So as ecologists, before you survey a site, you often want to look at what historical records there are available. Has anyone already been to the site in the past and observed any animals or plants that have been there previously? So for this site, previously there have been about 120 plants seen on the site, which is a pretty good list. There have been 2 previous botanical surveys, one done in 1995 and one in 2005. So that gave us a good baseline of data to look at. There'd also been a few incidental records. So there are a few butterflies and moths recorded, and in 2008 I brought the local school up into here and we did a small mammal survey. So we set out little humane traps where the animals could go in and be captured alive. We'd then look at them next morning and identify what they were. We sexed them and we weighed them, and we found that there were 3 different species living in the churchyard then, or that we caught. We had long yellow-necked mouse, we had bank vole, and we had field vole, and they were only in the coarser, taller grass area. So that's another reason this is a bit of a challenge. This is the nicer area, the lower grass, but actually the coarser grass is potentially a better habitat for the small moles, voles and mouses, because they can't get hunted as easily. So in the past we had about 130 species recorded in the churchyard. Since 2017, our Ventus Ecology has been volunteering, coming up here, running bio-blitzes, we've been running events with children, we've been running wildlife walks, bat walks and those sort of things, as well as regular repeated botanical surveys. So we've gone from having historically about 124 records to now we're over 1,500 recorded records. And from the number of species, we've gone from about 120, 130 species up to over 380 species. So we've more than tripled the number of plants and animals we've found in the churchyard. And all of that information we can use, and the plants can tell me how to manage the site, so we can use that to understand how to write our management report and help the church to maintain the gem that it is.
So who would have done those early records before we were involved? Who would have been here and recorded those species?
So in some cases they were people who just happened to walk by and recorded. That in 1995 Caring for God's Acre actually paid a botanist to come in and have a look. Sorry, in 2005. In 1995 it was a volunteer who came and surveyed the whole churchyard and recorded everything they could do.
So how could people, perhaps those that are watching this video, actually get involved in local burial grounds or churchyards themselves, and how could they record any wildlife and things that they see?
Okay, there's probably 2 different aspects that they could get involved with. First is the recording. Go out and join somebody like Caring for God's Acre when they go and visit a churchyard, and shadow they're ecologists and they're people who already have good ID skills, and they can help and tell you a bit like I've done, oh, this is false oat grass because, and the features. And you can use an app on your phone or a tablet or the website called iRecord. You can actually put your observations, your sightings into there, and they will get checked, and if people agree with them, they will then get into the national data set. So it's quite an empowering thing. You can go and survey your patch of land. You can hear and spot a tawny owl in that tree, take a photo, upload that record. That data will then get used nationally and internationally by conservationists and ecologists like myself to understand our landscapes and sites. So anybody, it's a really democratic process, anybody can get involved in recording. There's then the other side is we need labour, we need people to come out and help manage these churchyards. So even at this time of year when we're letting the grass grow, we've actually been along and mown the edges and cut the edges so the grass doesn't flop over, and it keeps it a little bit tidier. Tidy is a word I don't necessarily like in a conservation term, but it makes it more appealing to people. So even at this time you can do that. Later on there'll be group activities or individuals can get out. Maybe it's strimming, maybe it's scything, raking, building compost bins, building habitat piles, because things like slowworms and other reptiles love this kind of habitat. So that would be something that you could get involved with either caring for God's Acre or your wildlife trusts or other local charities.
So, for example, local mammal groups or bat groups and so on, they would perhaps visit sites like this, and
yes,
you could help them.
Yeah. So yes, if you're particularly interested in bats and you want to learn more information about them or small mammals or any group, have a search around or contact the Growing Confidence group, and they'll be able to point you in the right direction. So, and a lot of these groups are really encouraging to new members, and they want to engage with you and get you out there recording. And then you can take on your own patch, find your own churchyard or find your own local park, and go out there and see how many plants you can identify, how many birds you can identify. And what I'll guarantee is that when you come and do it next year, you'll find another 5 species, another 10 species. You'll suddenly realise that everything you dismissed as grasses last year, you're able to identify, and you'll start to build and build each year on more and more species.
And so just to recap, iRecord is the best system to use. So it's on a website and an app, and it's very easy to use actually, and you can record any plants or animals into there.
It's a really simple process. It takes you through step by step, and iRecord is part of the biological recording software that we have available to us. So biological recording is the recording of the who, what, where, when. So the who, at the moment, I'm seeing this Oxide Daisy, so I want to record this in a churchyard. The who, that's my name, Mark Duffell. The where, and we'd call that St Michael's Churchyard, Ford, and then we give it a grid reference. Now the lovely thing with the app is it automatically does that for you, so you don't have to understand how to write a grid reference potentially. Then the what, in this case it's Oxide Daisy. If you only know the common name, you can put the common names in. If you know it's Leucanthum vulgare, you can put the scientific name in. And then the when is the date. And those 4 bits of information are key. You can add further bits. If you're talking about birds, you might want to say, oh, it was a pair or it's a nest.
And it actually makes it quite fun to go out on a walk, have your phone, have your iRecord app, and just record stuff as you go along, and it kind of gives you a bit of a challenge and makes the walk quite fun.
Yeah, it is a challenge. Can you find more species than you did last time you were here? Can you find new species? Can you find the same species but in different areas? So in the survey, it was exciting this year to find a plant called Goldilocks, which is a little buttercup relative, but in a totally new bit of the churchyard, which I didn't think it was in there before. So even experienced people will find new things and make new discoveries.
So we've been up to the churchyard and we've installed some display boards here, which explain a bit about the species you can find here, how it's being managed, why it's special and important. So why is it important to have this kind of information here in the churchyard for people to see?
Well, we've done a very thorough survey and we've started to write and produce the management plan, and from this we've worked out what areas are of value ecologically and also to locals, and we've got to communicate that to them somehow. So we've got to say, why is this a good area here? Because otherwise, why don't we just mow it all flat every year and keep it really neat and tidy, mown short? once you explain that it's 12th century grassland, so this area behind me here is 12th century grassland, it's species rich meadows, and we've lost more than 90% of our meadows of this quality in the British Isles since the Second World War. That's only 70 years. That's just shocking to me.
That's 97% we've lost.
97%.
97%.
Yeah. So we've only got 3% of what's left. This is why this is important. We've got to conserve all these little pockets, and to me, churchyards and churchyards of this quality are these little jewels within the landscape. So within the wider landscape, we've become very efficient at managing our land, so we don't allow spaces for weeds. Now another reason for, so we can explain the value of it, but then we also need to communicate, okay, so we've left it apparently, we haven't done any apparent management to the churchyard here. What we have done is we've just cut along the edges so it stops the grass falling on the paths, but we need to then explain to people who are visiting that no, we haven't abandoned the grassland, we're actually leaving it until the end of July when all the flowers have seeded and they've dropped the seeds back into the grass. Those insects that need those flowers have also bred and reproduced, and then we can come in, and in July in this case we're going to come in and cut it or scythe it and take away that, and people can then understand that no, we're not abandoning, it's not left, we're looking after it, it's taken care of, because without they have a sense of belonging to this space, and if they feel it's neglected, then they're going to potentially be upset by that, and we've got to manage what their expectations are and what the expectations of the owners, the church societies. So we've got red clover here, Trifolium pratense, and it's an indicator of good, reasonable quality grassland. These beautiful pink, purple flowers, they're not really red, but and then the other character they've got is often they have these white chevrons, not always, but white chevrons on the leaves, with little bristly hairs all around the margins, and these are loved by bees and other pollinating insects, and you'll hear them a buzz when at this time of year. And actually, I don't know whether you can spot it, but on the back of this flower there's cuckoo spit. Now it's not actually the spit of a cuckoo, but it's made by a little invertebrate, a little leaf hopper, that the larvae live inside here, make this spit, and it protects them, it sort of cocoons them away from any predatory animals. And I can see also next to it one of my favourite grasses. This is yellow oat grass. If I just give it a tickle, it'll flop out. Or golden oat grass is another name. And this is an indicator of really nice, good quality habitat grassland. So having these two together is telling me that we've got nice vegetation here, along with other grasses. Like here we've got this is red fescue, and all of the grasses I'm mentioning are fine leaf grasses. They're quite delicate, quite thin leaves. They can sometimes look like single. We can see the two here, very fine rolled leaves. So they never really dominate. So that allows these herbs, like we've got the Catsair and the red clover. We've got a little bush vetch here as well coming through. Allows the other plants to come through and not be swamped out. Whereas in some of the lower bits of the grassland we've got a lot coarser vegetation. That's because there's more nutrients, whereas here is a lower nutrient area, and that's what we're trying to conserve. Here we've got a common plant found in meadows. This is ribwort plantain. In the churchyard we've just got fairly small amounts of it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We only want a little bit, we don't want it to dominate. It's got these very ribbed leaves, hence ribbed plantain or common plantain, and the flower heads are very discreet. They're pretty much little stamens hanging about, and there's not much else to see. But later on in the year, once the seeds have ripened, if you crush them in your head, you'll find you've got all of these bright green seeds, which you can actually, were traditionally used as a food. You made flour from it, so if we blow away, let the wind blow away all of the chaff, we'll be left with the seeds there. And it's a common plant that's spread all around the world, and in North America the North American Indians have actually called it white man's footprints, because it's found in wherever the white man spread. Although it's gone over in the sunnier parts of the churchyard, we've still got in the slightly more shady bits where it hasn't been dried off, we've got a plant called bush vetch, Vicia Cepium. It's a member of the pea family. You can see there's a pea pod there just by my thumb, and there's also an ant crawling all over the flower as well. So Vicia Cepium, or bush vetch, is often confused with common vetch, which is a much fresher colour. And I often think the way to remember it is a sepia film is a slightly dingy brown colour, and that describes this flower quite well. It's not the freshest of purple flowers, and the other shape is it's got these sort of almost coffin shaped leaflets. They're broader towards the bottom than they are down the tips. They go narrow, broad, wide. Sorry, narrow, broad, narrow. So Vicia Cepium, or bush vetch. You could also misheard it called as butch vetch, and that's because it's a bit more manly colours than maybe the slightly girlier pinks of common vetch. So this is white bryony dioica, and it's got these lovely leaves that always remind me rather of a cucumber, or maybe vaguely a bit fig leaf as well. They are a member of the Cucurbitaceae, which is the cucumber or gourd family, the squashes, so your courgettes and marrows and those sort of plants. And traditionally we'd have dug up the root and used it herbally. The berries are quite poisonous. Later on in the year they'll be blood red and hanging around on drapes, and this tree in the background is the yew, so they really contrast well with the foliage and of the yew.
So why are churchyards like this jewels in the landscape?
So yes, I've used the term jewels in the landscape. That's because as an ecologist I've got an appreciation of what the wider landscape's like. I've been out there and surveyed it. So in this area of churchyard, which is about 8 football pitches in the area, we've got around 200 plus species of plants growing here. If we were to go to a neighbouring farmland area, so a pasture where you might have your cattle, dairy cattle, or cattle for meat production, I could survey the whole field, and I've done this in the past down in Ludlow. I had a lovely big site, but in that whole field I got 7 species, and I managed to bump it up to 12 by looking in the farm gateways where the boggy bits were. So these were really agriculturally improved species, so like perennial ryegrass and white clover, so not species that have much ecological importance. Whereas here, so remember that was 7 species in an area that was several hundred hectares. Here in a 2 by 2 metre square, if I was to survey that here, I would find around 20 species. So this is what a lot of our landscape would have looked like in the past. This is 12th century species rich grassland, and a lot of our surrounding areas would have looked similar to this.
So just to sort of clarify, for a good meadow grassland like this we want low nutrients, whereas often people might think plants need nutrients to grow, high nutrients is good.
Yes, exactly. So if I was to do a soil sample, if I was allowed to dig in here and take away soil samples, I would find that the things like the nitrates, the nitrogens, the phosphates and the potassium levels would be very, very low here.